So anyways, yeah, Greg Mullen. Been with the Natural Resource Damage Program for a long time. If you haven't heard of the program, we're administratively attached to the Department of Justice. Have been with the Department of Justice since about the beginning. There was a couple of years there we were with DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. The program, I'm going to go through, give you a little bit of a background of what the Natural Resource Damage Program is, and but basically it's part of Superfund. It's part of what we have going here in the Superfund work going on in Butte. Back in when Superfund law was written in 1980, there's two arms of it. One, the direct cleanup, and then also natural resource damage law. That's part of Superfund. So it's really a great law, actually, and it's really exciting, I think, that what states, I guess the word is trustees, what trustees for natural resources can do with that money. I'm involved in about 28 states to get together once or twice a year from all over the country, and we talk about what we're doing in our particular states with natural resource damage, and the law is so I guess a lot of wiggle room is in the law in terms of how you can spend the monies, what you can do, and it's really a pretty exciting way to work. Many of the other states that have natural resource damage programs spend the monies in a variety of ways, or the feds spend it, or in some situations the responsible parties, like here in Butte, it would be British Petroleum spending it, natural resource monies. But here in Montana, British Petroleum does not spend any natural resource damage, cleanups. We do it all, the state. Speaking of ARCO BP, if you don't know, in terms of Superfund, they've been working in Montana since 1981, cleaning up Superfund, and I would say they probably spent at least $1 billion from Butte to Missoula over the past couple decades, and it's been a lot of work for them, but it's also been a lot of studies. Back when me and Ted Dwayne in the old days worked on things, everything was just studies before a lot of money was spent, and ARCO BP spent a lot of money on all sorts of studies, and the Superfund process has a process of remedial investigation that they have to go through before they can come up with a cleanup record of decision. So the amount of, I'm not going to call it research, but investigation that has been done in the basin, the Clark Fork River Basin, has just been phenomenal over the years, and we're still doing studies. So what I'm going to talk about today is this Superfund law in terms of we can spend the money on direct restoration, direct cleanup, which is something you can understand pretty easily, or we can replace those lost services, and I'll explain that as we go. But I'm involved. Our program's involved in doing both of these things over the years. So with that, and the area we're talking about is in what we call the Upper Clark Fork River Basin, all the way down to Missoula. A lot of the work, of course, we've done on Silbo Creek in the beginning of the Clark Fork River, Anaconda, and of course in Butte itself. And that's, of course, where all the mining took place. I do have a couple pictures here of mining. Whoops, okay, I get it down now. So we had the smelter in Anaconda, of course, and we had a lot of mining that all the material came from copper. The copper came from Butte, as you know. And the reason all of it was smelted in Anaconda, if you don't know, is because there's a lot of water there in Anaconda. So the water in Anaconda was enough from Warm Springs Creek that could process all the ore that came from Butte. So that's why, of course, in the old days, if you don't know, they did have a lot of smelters in Butte in the early days, about a lot, 10 or 11. And by 1900, most of the smelting occurred in Anaconda, although some of the smelting in Butte kept going till about 1910, 1911. And again, the ore that came from Butte, from the pit, one more picture, all the ore that came either from here or the tunnels went, to Anaconda because of all the water that's there, and it went by train by Silver Creek. So basically, when I want to talk about, I'll start with the different injuries. Three main injuries that we have that the state of Montana is trustee for is aquatic, terrestrial, and groundwater injuries. So the injuries themselves are kind of the basis of our lawsuit, and that theme, those three different injuries, we kept throughout our work over the past two decades in terms of when we started spending recoveries from our lawsuit with ARCO on these three different areas. So I'm going to focus today mostly on terrestrial injuries from Smelter Hill, Silver Creek, riparian areas. I'll show you some pictures of that. But groundwater injury was quite extensive, in the Butte area, as you know, bedrock injury and some alluvium throughout the Butte area. Anaconda, a lot of groundwater injury around where the smelter was itself and tailings in the Anaconda area. Injury to aquatic along Silver Creek and the Clark Fork. I don't know how many of you all have been to Silver Creek or the Clark Fork, but it looks a lot different now than it did before. I'll show a few pictures of that. So Silver Creek is an area about 10 miles downstream from here. Tailings that came from Butte were just kind of spread out throughout Silver Creek, and the main way those tailings ended up in Silver Creek was a flood in 1908. If you haven't heard of that flood, but that's when much of the tailings came down from Butte and landed in not only Silver Creek, but Warm Springs Ponds, and then the Clark Fork River, and then all the way down to Milltown, and then even past there. So, and Milltown's in Missoula. So these tailings, which have a lot of copper in them, and zinc, and other metals, but it's copper and zinc that are the most toxic to aquatic life, fish and aquatic insects. So that's what we're most concerned about from natural resource injury standpoint is the zinc and copper, not necessarily other mercury or, well, mercury is toxic to aquatic life as well.
Where was this picture taken, do you know?
Sure, that's called Ramsey Flats. It's right near Ramsey. Yeah. So right now it's completely vegetated, looks great. The creek's kind of on the other side. All the tailings were removed, and I'll show you a picture where they were moved to. But along Silver Creek itself, we being Department of Environmental Quality and Natural Resource Damage Program worked together on that project. DEQ was certainly the lead. Removed about 6.5 million cubic yards of tailings that went to what's called the opportunity ponds, which I'll show you in a minute. But the tailings were quite thick in some areas. That's near the picture I just took. And basically they were, most of them were removed. And that's where we took them all to opportunity ponds. Opportunity ponds, if you haven't been there, if you haven't heard of them, they're about 5 square miles of tailings that came out, slurried out from the smelter, and those tailings about 25 feet thick, 150 million cubic yards. So the 6.5 million cubic yards that we took from Silver Creek and put there isn't that much. When you look at that, and actually this picture's pretty cool because the tailings are all covered now with soil, about 18 inches of soil on top of all the opportunity ponds. So unfortunately, you can't go out there and see this anymore. And unfortunately, you can't see that anymore either. I mean, everything's been cleaned up in a lot of places. So also at the opportunity ponds, the Clark Fork River tailings, we're bringing them back here too. We're putting them in an area that hasn't been completely reclaimed, kind of mounting them up, and then we'll cover those tailings when we're done. What else do I want to say about, well, groundwater injury. There's also groundwater injury from the opportunity ponds as well, especially under the ponds, and then that's mostly maybe zinc and arsenic underneath the ponds, but the other constituents such as iron and manganese sulfate, they spread farther from the ponds, maybe a good 5 miles away, whereas most of the heavy metals stayed right under the ponds themselves. So I'm going to focus on the terrestrial injury today. And what we have from the terrestrial injury is not only what I just showed you in Silver Creek and opportunity ponds, but also in the Anaconda uplands there was injury to wildlife habitat. So that was the basis of our claim, is wildlife habitat. The state of Montana is trustee for wildlife, and so we looked at, the law allows us to look at wildlife habitat, not just, injury to wildlife themselves, but also the habitat itself. So that was our focus of the lawsuit. If you look at some of the other lawsuits, we just had the Deepwater Horizon, I don't know if you heard of that lawsuit down from the big oil spill 5 years ago. Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, all those Gulf states, they recovered approximately, Louisiana of course, $8 billion with a B of natural resource damage recovery from that. And there's another big oil spill that occurred in Alaska back in, way back in 1989, I believe, was the Exxon Valdez spill. And that recovery was about $900 million. But the point I'm trying to make is that on those type of injuries, those oil spills, the trustees had dead animals, dead mammals, dead ducks, dead geese. You could see these things and count them. Whereas here in Montana, we didn't have dead animals that we looked at, but we looked at the habitat was injured. And again, that's how we based our claim. So the injury here, especially on the left Stuckey Ridge, is there is no vegetation for the wildlife to eat, no habitat. And that was, again, mainly due to copper that came out of the stacks, which is not only toxic to aquatic life, like I just explained, but also phytotoxic to plants. Very phytotoxic to plants. I mean, we as humans, we can eat copper. We have copper in our vitamin pills, but bugs don't and plants don't. So the two parts, back to kind of Superfund law, which I started this talk on, we have cleanup, direct remediation. We look at EPA as taking the lead on that, looking at direct impacts to human health and the environment. I think the way Superfund law was written, human health was a big driver. But when we have Superfund sites like we have out west, especially here in Montana, the environment is really the main impact due to the mining out here than it was necessarily human health. Exception, of course, is right here in Butte with some of the exceedances of lead, for example, and Anaconda, some of the exceedances of lead and arsenic. But as a whole, the injuries that both EPA and the state look at from mining in Montana is to the environment. So restoration kind of picks up where remediation left off, but throughout the past 3 decades of this work, it's always been a challenge, if you would, to discern where remedy leaves off and where restoration takes over. For example, remedy, EPA may say, we're going to do X to clean up Silbo Creek, and the state of Montana, we would look at that and say, well, that would bring us so far, and that's what the law allows us to do, to look at what remedy would do, and then we, as I say here, pick up where remedy leaves off. And a lot of the times the discussions, lack of a different word, but discussions that we had with figuring out what remedy would be with EPA over the years is that sometimes where the remedy is argued to be the best point to leave off and call it good, if you would, we had discussions where we think you should go a little bit farther. So what I'm trying to say is that the difference between remedy and restoration isn't a fine line. It's not like, phew, that's remedy, that's restoration, like some of these sites, maybe in New Jersey where it's pretty cut and dry, the human health impacts, try to work on the plume and reduce the plume to MCLs. That's pretty clear cut. Here, when we're dealing with impacts in the environment, it's not as clear cut. So when I talked about Exxon, Valdez, and Deepwater Horizon off of Louisiana, those are some really big NRD claims. Our claim in the $240 million range for the Upper Clark Fork, that's pretty big too. That's probably number 3 or 4 in the country, to give it some perspective. But the other thing I want to make sure I talk about here is not only can we clean up these areas, but the law allows us to replace lost services. So these lost services could be hunting, fishing, other things that humans can do on these areas that were injured, and it can replace the lost ecological services such as the wildlife had on these areas. So that's why I started this conversation with how interesting the law is and how it allows us to do things that EPA, for example, can't consider doing with the, whatever funding they get for direct cleanup, or whatever cleanup they make the responsible parties do. So here's some of those lost recreational opportunities that I was just telling you about, and we look at that, and it's part of the lawsuit, the first lawsuit I'm getting ahead of myself. So right here, our first lawsuit recovery was in '99. Our first consent decree, we received $144 million. And when I say $2 million in land, that is along Silbo Creek. ARCO started buying up approximately 1,000 acres of land along Silbo Creek, and they gave that to the state when they were cleaning up Silbo Creek. And the reason that's significant, especially for you all that live here in Butte, is that most of Silbo Creek from here to Anaconda area, Highway 1 there, is publicly owned. So there'll be a trail, we're working on a trail that goes from here all the way to Anaconda, so that's significant. So that $2 million in land really turned out pretty well. And oftentimes with these settlements, the one we had in '99 and then the one again in 2008, what we also did was settle remedy. So Silbo Creek was estimated $86 million, the Clark Fork was estimated at $96 million. So what the ARCO in '99, then ARCO BP in 2008, they were anxious not only to settle the natural resource damage claims, but also settle the remedy claims that EPA had on both the Clark Fork River and Silbo Creek. So that's why I have these, shown here, the other parts of the settlements. Frankly, that's a driver. So a lot of times, at least our dealings in the basin has been by settling the remedial components. Kind of the restoration components were thrown in, if you would. Okay, yeah, let's settle that restoration at the same time. And then I mentioned a few other, these other sites are outside of the Clark Fork River Basin that I showed earlier, but they're on this table. I just left those in there. Okay, we don't want to look at that all day. So again, I'm going to, the 2008 settlement that I showed you right here was $72 million, and to break that $72 million down, the $68 million went to BAO right here in Butte, Clark Fork River, $27 million, and then 13 went to the uplands. And there is what I'm going to talk about a bit today, the restoration we did in the uplands. And a little bit of remedy too, so it's a little complicated. But before I go in there, let me just talk 1 second about, I talked about lost recreational opportunities and talking about the uplands, but since I'm right here in Butte, let me talk a minute about the groundwater injury. So groundwater injury was substantial in Butte and Anaconda, and what we've done over the past 2 decades is spend some of the recoveries of these monies that I just showed you. A considerable amount of that money went to Butte to replace groundwater losses by enhancing Butte's water supply and Anaconda's water supply. So Anaconda's water supply in the tune of about $40 million over the years, and then Butte's water supply in the tune of about $85 million. So you might, if you're good in math, you might say, well, that's about 144 right there. We collected quite a bit of interest over the years, probably another 130 in interest over the years. So that's why the numbers start to get high. So the replacement that we've done in Butte has been a new treatment plant that your water you're drinking from now from the Basin Creek treatment plant that cost $30 million. Much of the urban lines in Butte, probably maybe 30%, Pat can correct me, were replaced over the years because they were leaking. The big hole transmission line itself, the whole 18 miles of line was replaced. The dam down the big hole treatment plant itself, on and on, metering. So that's, when I started this conversation, that's why I'm really excited about natural resource damage law and what it allows us to do. I mean, that's really a huge boost for both Butte and Anaconda, that replacement aspect. Again, EPA can't come in and do those things unless it's direct injury to the groundwater itself for the people are drinking. So only example in Montana I can think of that would be in Milltown and Butte. I mean, Milltown and Missoula, where EPA actually did ask the responsible parties to replace drinking water for arsenic in the town of Milltown. So here we got the Anaconda Uplands, which I'm going to focus on. Butte Area 1, we all hear about it in the newspapers. That's part of the parrot tailings effort that you all have been hearing about lately. And then the Clark Fork River we're working on now with DEQ. DEQ is the lead on that work, as they were in Silver Creek that I talked about earlier. This is in the paper 2 months ago, so I saw it the other day and I took a picture of it. But that is the same 13 million that's mentioned here. Susan Dunlap from the Montana Standard did a little article on what we're talking about today, so that was timely. Although the premise of the article had to do with EPA was coming out with asking for public comment for a certain part of the remedy component, so but I won't go into that. So there's two things I'm going to mainly talk about today besides the overview of natural resource damage law, which I kind of just went over, is what we did at Stuckey Ridge over about a 5-year period. Here we basically were tasked through the 2009 settlement to work on the state-owned property. So what ARCO BP said was that, okay, we'll give you guys $13.3 million, but you guys, do what you need to do for restoration on these state-owned properties. But by the way, also do remedy. So here's a situation where we're actually the only situation that NRD program is doing both remedy and restoration. So my talk was, say, a restoration example and a replacement restoration example. But this example, it's a restoration example, but there's a little bit of remedy mixed in. So what I want to do is talk about this state-owned land, DNRC, Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. It's a state school trust parcel that happens to be very injured because of the stack that was here, the big stack, of course, and then there you guys see the flues at Old Works, the old smelter, as you drive to Anaconda. That's why this one section was probably the most hammered section in terms of injured section, in terms of releases from the air, except maybe around the stack itself, which if you haven't noticed, ARCO just capped the entire 500 acres around the stack over the past 3 years. I'm sure that was an expensive project. And the main reason they did that is because of the high arsenic levels. So that was actually a human health effort. So in proximity, Stuckey Ridge here, you can see the big stack right there. But I also want to point out the flues. You guys have seen these as you drive to Anaconda. So these flues, the Old Works smelter, again, took advantage of all the water from Warm Springs Creek, had large smelters there. I would guess larger than any of the ones in Butte. You think that's true, Pat? The Old Works are larger than any smelter in Butte? Okay. Pat's saying yes. So these Old Works, it was smelters. There's two. One's called Upper Works and Lower Works, and they were around from 1883 to 1900. So even though there was 7, 8, 9 smelters, smaller smelters here in Butte, these two were in Anaconda, again, taking advantage of all that great water from Warm Springs Creek. So on top of these flues were stacks, 150, 150, 180 feet high, and right over here is the beginning of the state section that I'm going to talk about, that we cleaned up. And here's some of the footings for that. And it's right above the golf course, to give you a perspective of where it's at. So here's the aerial. This is the section. It wasn't a full 640. It was a 480 acre section. But anyways, the first thing we did is we punched a road in to that area to get all the material up there, especially lime and compost. Again, you can see the flues here. So the picture I showed you before, with the drawing on top, is a stack right here. And the reason I did that is to show you the proximity of that stack, and the wind, of course, goes in this direction. So the wind blew on this section pretty hard. So that's why I said a few minutes ago that I think this section was one of the most hammered sections from aerial emissions. Of course, right here is pretty bad, too, in this area. So, like I said, first thing we did, we built a road, and these are actually lime piles. We got lime, sugar beet lime from Billings, and from the sugar beet sugar beet plant down there, and they gave it to us for free. But we had to ship it up here by truck. That wasn't free. And the reason we, oh, by the way, some of the gullies here were, 30 feet. These are like 30, 40 feet thick. So the erosion here is just incredible. So really, nothing grew on this whole section for, probably since, I'm sure in 1880 it looked okay. I mean, it looked great in 1880. It was a grassland, not a heck of a lot of trees. By 1890, I'm sure the erosion started. I mean, all the grasses were probably dead. And by 1900, it probably started looking like this. And then for the next 20 years, it really eroded. So I would say it looked like this since 1910, 1920. And the only thing we saw up there was thistle, Canadian thistle. So what we had to do, because the pH was so low in this 3.5 to 4 range, is add lime. And so we took a boatload of soil samples. Rich Prodigy, if some of you all know him, I worked with him on this project for the whole 8 years that the project was going on. And Rich took a lot of soil samples and calculated the lime rate that we needed, which is in the 20 to 20 tons per acre range. And the sugar beet lime worked great. It was really a good product. The pH ended up being in at a 7 range right after, by the time we were done incorporating it within a month. So that was a success. These trucks here spread the lime in the different areas. And the first thing we did, by the way, is best we could is grade everything. So all these smaller gullies were all graded so we can farm this area. These big ones we filled in, maybe to about here. We filled that in. I think to about here we filled that in, and we filled all this in. But some of these big ones are still there, but we put huge check dams on the bottom. And the main thing we had to do here is just reduce the amount of copper coming off this whole section, and to revegetate it. That was a requirement. And again, there's remedy and restoration. I'm not going to get into the specifics of what percentage was remedy and what percentage was restoration, but it was both in this example. So we had needed a D6 to bring incorporate the lime. This equipment was pretty aggressive. It wasn't easy, and sometimes it took 3 to 4 passes to get the lime all the way down to 12 inches. Some places we only did 6 inches, like I say here, but most of it, 65%, we had to get down to 12 inches. But it worked pretty good. A lot of the area looks like this now. If you want to go up there, I don't know if you've taken your class up there before.
Yes, so last year, Restoration 2, Rich Rogers took us actually up here, and we saw a big chunk of it. There's a couple of new students to the class, so they didn't see it, but some have an idea. I know Kevin was there,
right?
Or Nathan.
So yeah, no, we're pretty happy how it turned out. All these shrubs here, subshrubs, were in the seed mix, in Rich Prodigy's seed mix. So we got a lot of shrubs in this section just from the seed, without planting. We did do quite a bit of planting outside of the area that we farmed. There was another 100 acres or so that we're responsible for. So we had to do a variety of reclamation tools. We got different machinery in there to get vegetation going in some of the areas that weren't tilled, and with some really good success in other areas now as well. The issue, of course, is lime. So unless you can reduce that lime, I'm seeing the pH. Unless you can get that pH up with lime or plant your plants deep enough below the layer where the pH is so low, then nothing grew. We lost a lot of plants. 15,000, 20,000, not that many. 15,000 probably. So right now it looks like this. Slender wheatgrass, bluegrass, Nevada bluegrass, Great Basin wild rye. You can see some here. Those are probably the 3 main species that came in. We use seed from what's called Bridger Plant Materials Center. They actually gathered seed from the Anaconda area and grew a variety of those species, and actually grew them up and gave us a seed. So that seed did pretty well, and ARCO's using that seed now. And ARCO, speaking of ARCO, they're starting to work on the uplands now. So I told you they did this area around the stack. They about 450, 500 acres they actually capped with 18 inches of soil. But now BP ARCO is going to start working all these other areas in the Smelter Hill area and around the Stucky Ridge area. They're going to start working up there now. So we started early. We went in there before ARCO get up there, mainly because we were just ready to go, and ARCO BP was more busy working on the lowland areas around all the way up to Gayland and all around Opportunity Ponds and all that. They focused on the lowland areas, but now they're done with all those lower areas. When I say done, I mean reclaiming those areas that had impacts from the stack and the big stack, and now they're working in other areas. So,
Greg, this is the area of the Stucky Ridge, or?
Yeah, this is Stucky Ridge right here.
This is Stucky Ridge.
Yeah, so that's how close it is to the stack. Again, 480 acres section that we had to work on because it was state-owned.
And there was no cap here, right? It was just a lime addition.
Correct. Lime, compost.
Yeah.
In retrospect, we kind of wish some areas we maybe, I don't know how many acres, maybe 40, 50 acres, we could have pushed some of the real contaminated upper 6 inches, maybe dug a big hole and pushed it in there. Because what I'm getting at here about the diversity, cleaning soil, a bit of the diversity, is that in this place, the copper levels were so diluted that they were low. But there were definitely areas where the copper was the same as when we started and when we left. Even though we did all that grading and tilling, we still had copper, because it did go all the way down 6, 7, 8 inches, that the copper levels were still in the, say, 1500 range in many places. So the copper that was in the 1500, that is in the 1500 parts per million range in parts of these areas does not nearly have the diversity that the areas that are really clean do. So that was kind of a disappointment for us. The seed mix that Rich Progers used up there had many species. I want to say 14, 13 species. And some areas we only had the best 3 or 4. And when I say best, most tolerant to those type of copper levels. So anyways, that's kind of a lesson learned. If we did dig a hole and try to push that material in, that would have, I don't know, that would have been interesting. I don't know. I wish we tried that though. And I'm not saying that's something that necessarily needs to be done in other places in the basin, but because this was so hammered and influenced by those smelter emissions over 100 years, that I think, again, this area probably has higher copper levels than many other areas.
Greg, is there any sign that the root systems are reaching down below the mixing zone for the lime addition?
Yeah, we put some holes in. Yeah, it's getting below there.
They're surviving okay.
Yeah, I mean the good thing about here is the aerial emissions. Most of the metals, again, copper, zinc, cadmium, are the upper really the upper 2 inches. Maybe here down to 6 because it is so close to the stacks. But once we got 12 inches or below, the concentrations were quite low. So the roots just keep going. Yeah. And Great Basin Wild Rye, which is really coming in a lot now, not as much as at first. They have pretty deep roots, and so.
And is the area that's to the west of there that was hit hard that you didn't restore, that's still barren?
Right. I mean, some of those, the county owns some of that. When back in the mid-90s, before they built the golf course, when they decided to build the golf course, they did do reclamation on about 1,000 acres up there. So there is reclamation on some of those areas that was done in 94, 95, 96. It looks pretty good right now. But there's other areas that is kind of bare, and they're working on those as we speak. They're working on those right now, they being ARCO. And doing the same thing we're doing. Actually, EPA is kind of pleased with us. They're doing a lot of the things that we did by trial and error, and are taking some of the steps and techniques that we used and are using them on the areas that they are reclaiming in the uplands. So that's kind of a bonus by starting first. Because as I started way back, we considered the whole, there was 18 acres, 18 square miles that were injured. So from our perspective in the lawsuit, but we focused on, in this situation, just the areas that are state-owned. But still, those other areas were we called injured from the state's perspective. So we're glad to see ARCO doing good work on those other areas, and I have been talking with them and helping them any way we can. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears. So that was an example of restoration and how the law allows us to do direct restoration. Another example is Silbo Creek. We did a lot of direct restoration on Silbo Creek, above and beyond what Remedy did. So now I'm going to talk about the other part of the law to replace like kind or replace the services that were lost. So example here of replacement is land acquisition. So we've done quite a bit of land acquisition, about 66,000 acres, that's over 100 square miles of actual land that we've acquired, fee value, about 66%, or through conservation easements, about 33% of that 66,000 acres. So I would say that's a total of maybe 30 projects we've worked on in the past almost 20 years, land projects. I'll give you examples of some of those. So again, the same slide I showed before, but keep in mind this is for replacement of lost services. This isn't work on direct areas that are restored. And sometimes people don't understand that. You know, how come you're doing work that, outside of Butte and Anaconda? And we hear that at times. You should spend every penny on the areas that are injured directly. Well, the law allows us to do this. And one example, a good example is Exxon Valdez in Alaska. They received $900 million. They spent half their money on land. So half the money that Alaska got back in, it took them to 94 before they got the money, 95. They spent half on land. So, and they're done spending their money now, but I just want to give that as an example. So our biggest land purchase for this replacement of lost wildlife habitat was the Spotted Dog Wildlife Management Area, which is Deer Lodge right here. So it's due north and east of Deer Lodge. That was the biggest one we purchased, and it's these hash lines. And that was back in 2010. And then lately we've been working on a few more. This Clark Fork River Ranch we just closed on last year. And we worked with the landowner, and he carved off 5 miles of the river for the ranch. Here it is right here, south of Deer Lodge. So this 5 miles, it's 2.5 miles, the crow flies, will now be, citizens of Montana can use in perpetuity. And the upland area is good wildlife habitat. And this picture is taken probably right here, probably right there. This next photo. So again, we look at providing wildlife habitat that was lost, and we want to make sure there's recreation involved in these land deals. So important, the citizens of Montana and elsewhere get to use the property, such for hunting or whatever, and it's good for wildlife. Here's an example of an easement that we closed on last year as well. Here's an example where a rancher came to us. He had 3,000 acres, and he said, I want to buy this really bad. And he said, can I do an easement on this property and then use that money to put an easement on this property for a total of, I'm sorry, there's 5,000 acres, for a total of 8,000 acres. And we said, yeah, that sounds like a great project. And we worked with Five Valleys Land Trust, and we got this done in less than about a year, which is pretty fast for these type of deals. And so right now, hunting's allowed throughout the area, and other restrictions on there is no subdivisions and well, right here, like I say, public hunting and subdivision restrictions in perpetuity. That cost us $3.5 million. So easement is another example of the land purchases. And like I said, we provide permanent public access, and some of the main provisions that are in the easement, which runs with the land in perpetuity. I don't know if you all knew much about easements themselves, but they run with the title of the land forever. So if somebody wanted to sell, say we have an easement on this property, this is a different one, this is near Phillipsburg. If somebody wanted to sell that property, those easement restrictions remain. Here's Silbo Creek, by the way. I talked about earlier, I just threw this in as my last slide. So thank you.